Welcome to this week's lesson of PCU. In this lesson, I'd like to introduce to you a very famous typical combination in chess openings or sometimes middle game. It's called the Bishop H7 sacrifice. And I'll show you in a second what are the main characteristics of this pattern. Here we go with our first sample example on this theme. Here are the important actors in this combination. One of the first key pieces is the bishop on d3. The next one is a knight on f3. And the third one is a queen, typically either on e2 or d1 behind the knight. Many times it's also quite important, like in this case, to have a bishop on c1 which is guarding the g5 square. Okay, ready to go. So, here comes the combination. Bishop sacrifices itself for only one pawn on h7. As we know, those three key pawns in front of the king are key defenders. So by removing one of them, it opens up the h-file and at times, like this one, can give a winning attack to the other side. In such situations, if the king does not capture the bishop, first of all, white already won a pawn. Second of all, many times white is still able to develop a strong attack, either by simply retreating the bishop or at yet other times bring the knight to g5 and then try to get the queen to h5. So most of the time it's only an issue whether what happens after black captures the bishop. As I said, if black does not capture, white already won a pawn. So it already means typically that the combination is sound. So here comes the second typical move in such endgames. Knight g5. Check. Now, white gave a check and black has 4 squares to go to. Some of them are really bad. For example, moving to the corner right now to h8 would allow an immediate checkmate in 2 moves. So that's pretty much out of question. Moving to h6 in situations when white has a bishop on c1 or somewhere else on this diagonal is also pretty much out of question because white can simply make a discover check, for example, by capturing the pawn on f7, which is a double check in fact, and then capture the black queen. In some cases, white may have even better options. But it's quite important not to waste your time to calculate unnecessary things. Because at the moment when you need to decide whether you want to sacrifice your bishop on h7 or not, what you need to decide is whether does black have an escape or not. And it's a minor detail whether white would have an even better way than winning a queen or not. So while when you get to this moment, for example, instead of knight captures f7 in this moment, you may spend a little bit of time figuring out if you have something even better than winning the queen. However, from the perspective of sacrificing your bishop on h7 or not, you may as well stop your calculation after you notice that you're winning the queen after knight f7 check right now or knight e6 check even. When you get to the position you see right now on the board, you may look around, see if queen g4 may be even better or queen d3. You may have other alternatives. And then you deal with it if you get there. However, much more crucial variations would be if after a check with the knight g5, the two big question marks typically are, what happens if the king goes to g6 or back to g8? Generally speaking, King g6 is the better reply unless king g8 can survive. Well, let's start with king g6 in this case. Here, after king g6, white has an excellent way to keep chasing the black king. White should continue here by giving a check with the queen on c2. If the black king moves, for example, to h5, white can checkmate in just 2 moves by playing queen h7, and now I think white has several choices to checkmate. Have fun figuring out all of them. So, after king g6, queen c2 check, of course the key move is for black to block the check by playing f5. And now a very important pattern for such and similar combinations. The en passant after pawn takes on f6, and now this created a check again by the white queen. King has to take back on f6, and now comes queen c6, checking the black king. The black king has to be really careful where to go to avoid the immediate checkmate after queen e6. So the only move to avoid that is to move to e5. And then again, white would follow up with f4, chasing the king, king d4, and yet another chase with a check, king d3, and the chase continues until the king has nowhere to go. Now, this is one of those things again, as you can see, the checks just keep coming and the checkmate arrives. Again, after you would see a position that the black king is wandering around on e5 with the king, and you still have a queen, a bishop, and a knight chasing the king, I think it's safe to say that you can stop calculation. You can trust that that should be winning. You can trust your instincts and you deal with it when you get there. So let's go back again to the key position where we give the check with the knight on g5. And in addition to king g6, of course, we need to deal with the main move, king g8 at this moment. And this is the very basic pattern that we sacrifice the bishop, we give the knight check, and we follow it up with the queen moving to h5, threatening to checkmate on h7. What is very important in such combinations is to make sure that your opponent wouldn't have, for example, a bishop on a light square like on c8 that could move to f5 and guard that h7 square. Because if that would be the case, the whole combination would not work. Remember to look out for that. Another important element is that white has a pawn on e5. And for example, for the same reason, if black would have a knight on d7 and that pawn wasn't there on e5, that knight again could go to f6 and guard the h7 square again. Again, black has no knight, and even if they would, white does have a pawn on e5 guarding that key f6 square. So it's not an issue in this particular position. However, those are the things you need to look out for. Whether does black have a piece, whether a bishop, a knight, or a queen, that may protect that h7 square where white is about to checkmate. If black does not have any piece that can guard the key h7 square, typically the only other escape attempt is to move the rook from f8 somewhere to clear an escape route for the black king on f8 and beyond. So therefore, black would play rook to e8. After rook e8, white now can win in various ways. First of all, here comes the typical standard way. White first captures the pawn, and then moves back, and then checks from h7, then checks from h8, and then checkmates on g7. Remember this pattern because this is very common for all such combinations. Although I have to add that in this particular position that we have on the board, White can do even better. White can checkmate even quicker, namely by check on h7, and now a very important move, check on a3, forcing one of the black pieces to block the check and block with that also the escape square of the black king, and immediately announce checkmate. So in a nutshell, this is the typical bishop h7 combination. Let's move on. I'll show you a quick little game played in my native country, Hungary, some years ago. And I'll give you an idea, for example, how can early in the game such type of position arise. It can arise from a variety of openings, including, as you can see, queen-pawn opening. We'll see king-pawn openings as well in a next example. I'll just quickly kind of play through the opening moves. As you can see, both sides are developing their pieces, nothing really unexpected happening. White is playing cautiously, delaying castling as the center is rather closed and aren't any open files, and the king is ready to castle at any minute it would be needed. And in this position, Black made a major mistake that cost him the game pretty much right away. The black bishop is badly needed on e7 to guard the g5 square, so after a knight appears there, especially after the standard combination that we saw an example of a few minutes ago, the black bishop would be able to trade for that knight, and in which case the combination would not work. However, here Black made a very careless move and moved the bishop back to f8. And now White is ready for action and can play bishop takes h7, king takes, and here White may give the knight g5 check right away, works as well, or even more forceful, giving less options for Black, is first giving the queen check, king g8, and then play knight g5. And now Black is in a pretty sad situation. The f6 square is controlled by the e5 pawn, which is quite important. So knight f6 is no real defense, and that would be the only way Black could guard the h7 square. Moving the bishop from f8 would still result in checkmate in just a couple of moves. And other than that, the only other alternative for Black is to give up the queen for the knight, which of course would leave White with a very significant material advantage. Let's move on to our next example. And this is another combination on the same theme, but we're involving a little bit another element as well. As you can see, the white pawn is on h4. And with that, and the additional element is that there are situations when after, for example, the bishop sacrifice on h7 and king takes and knight g5, even though that the black bishop is able to take the knight, White is ready to take back with the pawn and open the H file for the rook, which is rather important. So after king g8, queen h5, Black would have an unsolvable trouble with the checkmate threat coming on h8. Opening the f7 square is only a temporary solution because White has that pawn immediately appearing there, and Black would be lost. Let's go back to the beginning of this combination. So after bishop h7, king captures h7, knight g5. Black is facing pretty similar problems as in the previous combinations. If king goes to g6, the queen can give the check again from that same diagonal, from e4 this time, and then after king h5, white can choose from a variety of checkmates in 2. And if the king instead goes back to g8, then again white is ready to bring the queen to h5. If bishop takes knight, pawn takes back, as we already saw, or if the black rook is trying to create an escape route for the black kings through f8 and e7, then not queen h7, in which case the king indeed would escape, but take the pawn on f7, follow it up with queen to g6, threatening checkmate on h7, king g8, and then advance the h-pawn. Another very important pattern, advancing it all the way to h6 in order to open the h-file and to involve our rook in the attack. Again, white's attack is extremely strong here. And let's see another example, this time from an e4 opening. One of the most common openings to see the bishop h7 sacrifice is the French defense. So if you do play the French with the black, make sure you're aware of it and avoid it unless the combination does not work for some reason. And for white, look out for such opportunities. So these are just kind of some random developing moves in the French defense, but that is a reason why black makes an exception oftentimes in the French, and after developing the knight on e7 and the dark squared bishop, delays the castling a bit. In fact, there are many situations when the black king indeed would castle to the queen's side or stay in the middle for a relatively long time, and they can do that because of the blocked up closed type of center that you can see on the E and D files. In this position already, as early as move 7, white is ready for action, ready to sacrifice the bishop. Again, if black does not accept the sacrifice, it means that white won a pawn and the h-file has opened, giving white a strong attack. Of course, if the combination is successful, it's still the lesser damage for black than getting checkmated immediately or losing significant material. Let's see what happens if black accepts the sacrifice. As I mentioned, that's the real challenge typically. And now comes knight to g5. If, for example, the king goes back to g8, then white is ready with the typical queen h5, threatening with checkmate immediately. Black needs to move the rook to make space. Now, the check and check on h8 is the right move, but it's not a checkmate yet because the black knight is ready to block it. But now white has still a winning attack after knight h7 check, king e7, bishop to g5, which is a skewer. If the king moves, of course, the queen is lost, so black needs to look for a way to block the check, and blocking with the pawn would not work because after queen takes pawn on g7, it's immediately checkmate. On the other hand, if the knight moves to f6, white would simply capture the pawn on g7, and then on the following move, the knight on f6, leaving white with an easily winning position, at least up 2 pawns. Let's go back again to the key moment in such combinations when black can choose from 4 different squares, but typically only 2 are seriously to be considered. What happens if the king goes back to g8 or the king goes ahead to g6? After king g6, the most typical move is, other than giving a check on d3 or on the diagonal, would be to move the queen to g4. And that's exactly what white needs to do here. The purpose of this move is to create a discovery, such as knight capturing the pawn on e6, which would be a discovered check. On one hand, attacking the black queen. On another hand, also, like right now, if, for example, black would play pawn takes pawn, knight takes e6 check, also would immediately result with a checkmate on g7. So try to remember these patterns because these ideas come around quite frequently when we talk about the bishop h7 sacrifices. A very typical move that you need to be aware of is black playing f5 in such situations. In this situation, it's very typical to look at two options. Either to do en passant right away, such as this, or the other one is, which in this particular case is even better, to maintain the discovery threat by playing queen g3. Now the white knight still is threatening to capture the pawn on e6, and if black plays f4, white can just go back again to g4, and black pretty much has hard time to finding defense. For example, after the queen would move to e8, so after knight e6, black would not lose the queen, white would continue by playing h4. And that's another very typical idea I suggest you take note of. And the idea is to try to push h5 with the support of the rook and forcing the black king into the dark square diagonal c1 through h6 and then to another discovery. For example, again, if pawn takes pawn, h5, king h6, and again white would have a discovery, this time from the bishop, and then the following move, queen takes g7, checkmate. And finally, let's see the jewel of the week. And here we go with the beautiful endgame by Kubel. In this endgame, there is a complete material balance, and typically such endgames should end in a draw. However, because of the unfortunate positioning of the black pieces, white actually has an amazing win. First, try to figure out how to do this. It's not simple, so don't get discouraged if you have difficulty figuring it out. It should, I guess, take time in any case, even for experienced players, may take 15-20 minutes figuring this one out. The challenge is that the g7 square is well guarded by the black queen. Also, if white just, let's say, gives a random check on h2 or on the h file, black will block the check with the bishop, and it's not so simple how to win. So here is the beautiful sequence of moves to win the game. First, let's see why it doesn't quite accomplish the goal to give the check, and after bishop blocks, play queen e5, and then move the queen down to e8. Well, if you thought of this plan, you're on the right track, kind of. Because this would create, on one hand, a discovered check, winning black's queen. On the other hand, move the bishop to h6, which would be all checkmate right away. However, the problem is that black now would have the option of moving the queen to f7 and pretty much forcing the exchange of queens, which would automatically end the game in a draw. So let's go back again and think how to improve on this idea. Well, the idea was right, but white needs to refine it, and namely by getting the queen to the 8th rank, but to a different square. So now white is again using the ladder method of moving up to the desired square by moving up and up and up. And moving further up, queen d3, and now moving the queen to h3. So that's where we want to be. Now, if the queen blocks, of course, the solution is simple. We checkmate right away. So after queen h3, the bishop needs to block. And now, one more important check, going back to c3, forcing the black king to g8. And now the queen goes down to c8, to the 8th rank, not to e8, but c8. So now queen f7 wouldn't help at all because bishop h6 would be checkmate on the following move. And black's problem right now is that white is threatening to move the bishop to c5 and attack the black queen. And amazingly, with all reality, the black queen is pretty much trapped. As we said, the queen couldn't go anywhere on the 7th rank other than f7, where it wouldn't be captured, and if it goes to f7, then bishop h6 wins. And on the other hand, if the black king is trying to get out of the discovery, then for the unfortunate situation for black, the black king itself takes away that last escape square from the queen, and even though there is no discovery, the bishop simply just moves to c5 and traps the queen. Pretty amazing, isn't it? Well, I hope you enjoyed this beautiful puzzle and that you remember the patterns I was showing you about the standard bishop h7 sacrifices. Thank you for listening, and so long until next week.